There was a moment every month when Michael Turner stood in the checkout line at a small grocery store in Dayton, Ohio, holding only a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs, and wondered how his life had narrowed to this. The shelves around him were full snacks, fresh meals, small comforts. But his hands were always empty of anything that wasn't necessary. He watched the person ahead of him place a magazine on the counter without thinking. Then a candy bar, then a bottle of soda. Small things, thoughtless things. Michael looked down at his own items and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He could afford more, technically. But he never bought more, not for himself, not anymore. Every dollar had a direction before it reached his wallet. Rent, utilities, gas, his mother's medication, his sister's phone bill. There was no category left for want, only need. From the outside, Michael looked stable, early 40s, steady job, quiet manner, no visible struggle. People assumed he was careful with money, responsible. They didn't see the years of quiet decisions that trained him to erase himself from his own life. He paid, took his receipt, and stepped back into the cold evening, grocery bag light in his hand. The sky was already dark. Streetlights flickered on. Another ordinary day ended without anything to mark it as his. And this habit of absence had a longer history than anyone knew. Michael worked maintenance at a regional hospital, the kind of job that ran quietly behind everything else. Fixing doors, replacing lights, cleaning spills no one talked about. He worked nights often, when hallways emptied and machines hummed softly. It suited him, less conversation, fewer questions. He arrived on time, did his work carefully, and left without drawing attention. His co-workers joked about vacations, new phones, weekend plans. Michael listened, nodded, and smiled when expected. He never joined in, not because he didn't want those things, but because he didn't allow himself to want them anymore. Wanting felt indulgent, unsafe. Over time, he had trained himself to look past anything that wasn't essential. New shoes became worn shoes repaired. Meals became fuel. Entertainment became sleep. He told himself it was discipline, that he was being practical. But sometimes, alone in a supply closet or walking through an empty corridor at 3 in the morning, he wondered when practicality had turned into something else entirely. And that question followed him home every night. Michael's apartment was small and carefully maintained, like a space designed for temporary living that somehow became permanent. The furniture was mismatched, mostly inherited or second-hand. The television was old, the walls bare. There were no decorations that hinted at personality, no objects bought just because they made him feel something. Everything had a purpose. Everything earned its place. He cooked simple meals, ate standing sometimes, and cleaned immediately after. Disorder felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. On weekends he did laundry, grocery shopping, and nothing else. Friends had slowly stopped calling over the years, not from conflict, but from repetition. Maybe next time. I'm busy. Another day. Michael didn't blame them. He understood how someone who never chose himself could slowly disappear from other people's lives. At night, he lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the building settling. Pipes, footsteps, a television somewhere through the wall. Life continuing around him, full of small choices he no longer made. And, beneath that routine, something waited quietly to be acknowledged. The reason Michael never bought anything for himself wasn't something he talked about, because it didn't feel like a story. It felt like a responsibility that never ended. Years ago, when his father passed and his mother's health began to decline, Michael stepped into a role without ceremony. Bills needed paying, appointments needed managing, support had to come from somewhere. His sister was younger, still finding her footing. Michael didn't announce his decision. He just adjusted his life around it. One sacrifice became another, then another, until sacrifice stopped feeling like a choice at all. It became his identity. He told himself this was what being dependable looked like, that this was adulthood. But some nights, standing in his quiet apartment, he wondered what parts of himself he had set aside permanently. And that wondering was becoming harder to ignore. Michael's days followed a careful pattern that left very little room for impulse. He woke before his alarm most mornings, not because he needed to, but because his mind rarely rested long enough to let sleep settle deeply. He made coffee at home, the cheapest brand, black and strong, and drank it standing by the counter. Breakfast was optional. If he felt lightheaded, he ate. If not, he didn't. He dressed in the same rotation of clothes, all clean or worn just enough to be familiar. On the drive to work, he passed billboards advertising things he'd stopped noticing years ago. New cars, weekend getaways, limited-time offers meant to create urgency. None of it reached him. Michael had trained himself to move through the world without responding to invitation. At work, he fixed what was broken, often without being thanked, and that suited him. Gratitude felt unnecessary. He wasn't doing anything special. He was just maintaining the balance he'd built his life around. But sometimes, while replacing a light fixture or tightening a loose railing, he caught himself wondering what it would feel like to do something unnecessary, something chosen only because it felt good. The thought made him uncomfortable, like touching something hot. And discomfort had become his signal to turn away. Once a month, Michael visited his mother's apartment across town. He brought groceries, checked her medication, fixed whatever small things had broken since his last visit. She thanked him every time, the same way, with the softness that made him nod and change the subject. He didn't want gratitude. Gratitude made it feel like a burden. He preferred routine, predictable needs, predictable solutions. His sister called occasionally, usually stressed, usually apologetic. Michael reassured her without meaning to. "It's fine," he'd say. "I've got it." And he did. He always did. But after the calls ended, he sat quietly, feeling the weight of what he'd promised, without ever formally agreeing to it. Supporting them had reshaped his understanding of himself. He wasn't a man with desires, he was a system. Reliable, invisible, necessary, and systems aren't built to ask what they want. One evening after work, Michael stopped at a diner near the hospital, not to eat, just to wait out traffic. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee. Around him, people talked about nothing important. Weekend plans, weather complaints, a birthday coming up. The waitress mentioned a slice of pie that had just come out fresh. Michael smiled politely and declined. He watched someone else order it instead, watched the plate arrive, steam rising, fork cutting into something soft and warm. He felt no jealousy, only distance, as if those moments belonged to a version of life he no longer participated in. When he paid, he left exact change and walked out into the evening, the bell over the door ringing behind him. The night air felt heavier than usual, and for the first time in a long while, he noticed the weight. At home, Michael sat on the edge of his bed and removed his shoes carefully, lining them up the way he always did. He thought about the pie, not the taste, but the ease of the choice. How simple it had been for the other man to say yes. Michael tried to remember the last time he'd said yes to something unnecessary. The memory didn't come. That absence unsettled him more than he expected. He lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the building. Tomorrow would be the same. He knew that. But knowing didn't bring comfort anymore. And somewhere in that quiet room, a question had begun to take shape. The question didn't arrive loudly. It didn't interrupt Michael's routine or force him to stop what he was doing. It simply stayed. It followed him through his shifts, through the long hospital corridors where the floors reflected ceiling lights like still water. It waited while he changed filters, tightened bolts, reset alarms. "What do you want?" The words didn't accuse him. They didn't demand an answer. They just existed, floating somewhere behind every practical thought. Michael tried to ignore them the way he ignored hunger or fatigue. He focused on tasks, on lists, on what needed to be done next. But the question had patience. One night, while sitting alone in the break room, he noticed a vending machine humming softly against the wall. He'd passed it every shift for years without stopping. This time, he stood in front of it. He looked at the rows of snacks, all unnecessary, all small. He reached into his pocket, felt the bills there, and hesitated. He could afford it. The cost was meaningless in the larger picture. But his hand didn't move. He stepped back, feeling something close to embarrassment, as if he'd almost broken a rule no one else knew existed, and walking away felt heavier than staying. The next weekend, Michael helped his mother clean out a closet she hadn't opened in years. Old coats, boxes of papers. Things saved just in case. In one box, he found a photograph of himself from his early 20s, standing beside a used car he'd just bought. He remembered that day clearly. The nervous excitement, the feeling of having chosen something for himself, even if it wasn't perfect. He stared at the photo longer than necessary. His mother noticed and smiled softly. "You always were careful," she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a memory. Michael nodded, slipped the photo back into the box and sealed it. On the drive home, the image stayed with him. Not the car, but the version of himself who still believed his needs could exist alongside responsibility. And that memory quietly unsettled the balance he'd built. At work, Michael began noticing how often people replaced things without guilt. A broken mug, a torn jacket, a phone with a cracked screen. They didn't debate the decision internally for days. They didn't measure it against someone else's needs. They simply acted. The realization didn't make him angry, it made him curious. Had he always been this way, or had he slowly trained himself into disappearance? One night, while walking to his car after a shift, he stopped at a gas station and went inside. He bought fuel, paid, then stood near the counter longer than needed. There was a rack of inexpensive sunglasses by the register. Practical, useful, his eyes rested on them. He imagined owning something new, untouched, bought without explanation. He picked them up, felt their weight, then placed them back. He walked out with nothing but the receipt, and the emptiness of his hands felt deliberate. That night, Michael didn't sleep well. He lay awake, staring into the dark, listening to distant traffic and the ticking of the clock on his nightstand. He thought about how easily he denied himself, how automatic it had become. He wondered what would happen if he didn't. Not a grand rebellion, just one small exception. The thought frightened him more than financial uncertainty ever had. Because it wasn't about money, it was about permission, and Michael had never given himself that. By the time morning came, he hadn't decided anything. But the question remained, clearer now, closer to the surface than before. And it was waiting for an answer he wasn't sure how to give. The opportunity didn't arrive dressed as change. It came disguised as convenience. One afternoon, after finishing an early shift, Michael found himself at a thrift store a few blocks from the hospital. He hadn't planned to go in. He just wanted to avoid traffic and wait out the rush hour. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and detergent. Racks of clothes stood quietly, sorted by size and color. People moved slowly, thoughtfully, touching fabric, checking tags. Michael walked the aisles without intention, hands behind his back, the way he always did in places designed for choice. Then he saw a jacket, plain, brown, his size. He lifted it from the rack and tried it on without looking in the mirror. It fit comfortably, warmer than the one he'd been wearing for years. He checked the price. Affordable, reasonable. He stood there longer than necessary, jacket still on, weighing the moment. This wasn't indulgence, it wasn't luxury, it was practical. Still, his chest tightened. He imagined explaining the purchase to no one in particular. The idea felt unnecessary and exhausting. He hung the jacket back where it belonged and walked out empty-handed the way he always did. But leaving it behind didn't bring the relief he expected. That night, Michael noticed how cold his apartment felt. The heater worked, but warmth took time. He sat on the couch in his worn jacket and thought about the one he hadn't bought. The thought annoyed him, not because he wanted the jacket, but because it lingered. He was used to decisions disappearing once made. This one stayed. At work, his focus drifted. He caught himself thinking about small, unnecessary comforts, a better pair of gloves, new work boots, things that would make life easier, not more impressive. He reminded himself of priorities. Bills didn't disappear because he wanted something. Responsibility didn't pause. But the internal argument felt weaker than before, like a rule repeated too often without being questioned, and repetition was starting to lose its authority. The following week, Michael returned to the thrift store. He told himself it was practical, that his jacket was worn thin, that winter was coming. The same woman stood at the counter, the same soft music played overhead. He went straight to the rack. The jacket was still there. That felt like coincidence, but it also felt like permission. He tried it on again and looked in the mirror this time. He didn't see someone selfish. He saw someone tired, someone who deserved to be warm. He paid in cash, hands steady, heart racing slightly. The receipt felt unfamiliar in his pocket. Outside, he put the jacket on immediately. The weight of it felt grounding, and for the first time something new belonged to him. Wearing the jacket didn't change Michael's life. Bills still came, responsibilities remained. But something subtle shifted. He walked differently, not proudly, just present. At work, no one noticed. That was fine. The change wasn't meant to be seen, it was meant to be felt. That night, back in his apartment, he hung the jacket carefully in the closet and stood there for a moment, hand resting on the door. Buying it hadn't undone his discipline. It hadn't erased his care for others. It had simply made space for him to exist alongside it. And that space was quieter but fuller than he expected. After buying the jacket, Michael became more aware of his habits, not because they changed overnight, but because he could finally see them clearly. The way he paused before every purchase, the way his hand hovered over shelves and then retreated. He noticed how often he said no without fully asking himself the question. At the hospital, he worked the same long shifts, repaired the same doors, walked the same quiet hallways, but internally something had loosened. He no longer felt like he had to disappear completely in order to be dependable. Dependability, he realized, didn't require self-erasure. It only required consistency. That understanding settled slowly, like dust after movement. He didn't rush to test it. He let it exist quietly, observing how it felt to carry responsibility without suffocating under it. And awareness, once gained, refused to fade back into habit. One Saturday morning, Michael stopped at a hardware store on his way home. His old work gloves had split at the seams weeks ago. He'd been taping them, telling himself they were still usable. This time, he picked up a new pair. Basic, durable, nothing fancy. He stood in the aisle, feeling the familiar tension rise, then pass. He didn't justify the purchase. He didn't argue with himself. He paid and left. In the parking lot, he sat in his car and stared at the gloves resting on the passenger seat. They weren't symbolic, they were practical. But the act of buying them felt different from before. It felt allowed. and permission, once practiced, becomes easier to repeat. At his mother's apartment, Michael noticed the way she watched him move around the kitchen, fixing a cabinet hinge, replacing a light bulb. When he finished, she touched his arm and said, "You take good care of things." He smiled, unsure what to say. He wondered if she meant the apartment or him. On the drive home, the thought stayed with him. He had spent years caring outward, believing there was no room left to turn inward. But maybe care wasn't something that ran out. Maybe it expanded when shared more evenly. The idea felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. And unfamiliar ideas had begun to feel possible. One evening, after a long shift, Michael stopped by the same diner where he once declined pie. This time, he ordered soup and a sandwich. Nothing extravagant. He ate slowly, sitting by the window watching cars pass. No guilt followed the meal. No mental calculations lingered. He paid, left a small tip, and walked back to his car feeling steady. Life hadn't changed directions, but its weight felt more balanced now, spread more evenly between obligation and presence, and balance, once felt, is hard to forget. As winter settled into Dayton, Michael's routine continued, but it no longer felt as rigid as before. The cold mornings were sharper now, frost tracing the edges of car windows, breath visible in the air. Michael wore the jacket he'd bought, zipped it up, and noticed how it held the warmth close. It wasn't just physical comfort, it was the quiet reassurance of having chosen something that helped him. At work, the nights felt long as ever, but less draining. He still moved carefully, still did his job without asking for recognition, but he no longer felt like he was shrinking himself to fit inside responsibility. He spoke a little more during breaks. Nothing personal, just enough to be present. He realized that presence didn't cost him anything he couldn't afford, and that realization stayed with him through the colder nights. One evening, while sorting through bills at his kitchen table, Michael noticed something subtle. The numbers were tight, but they weren't crushing. They never had been. What had been heavy was the belief that there was no room for him in his own life. He folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the drawer. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and unhurried, covering the street in quiet layers. Michael stood by the window and watched for a while. He thought about how many years he'd measured his worth by how little he needed, how invisibility had felt safer than desire, and that thought felt like a door gently closing behind him. Michael didn't suddenly become someone who spent freely or chased comfort. He still lived simply. He still put others first when it mattered. But now, when his shoes wore thin, he replaced them. When he was hungry, he ate. These were small changes, barely noticeable from the outside. But inside, they softened something that had been held too tightly for too long. One night, walking home under streetlights, he felt tired in a way that came from work, not from denial. The difference mattered more than he expected, and that difference followed him quietly into the night. If you passed Michael Turner on the street, you wouldn't see a story. You'd see an ordinary man going home after work, and that was the truth. His life was ordinary, quiet, measured. But inside that ordinariness lived years of unseen choices, of care given without applause, of wants set aside until they nearly disappeared. He never became someone who bought things for himself easily. He simply became someone who allowed himself to exist alongside responsibility. And sometimes that is the most honest kind of survival there is. And somewhere right now, someone else is learning the same permission in silence.